war a nation can use against its enemies. Every detail marked on a military map could mean the difference between life and death for those fighting on the front line. As warring factions struggle to capture territories, accurate maps are vital for attack and defense plans. Information about enemy positions and weaponry must be added to military maps on a daily basis. Gathering this information is an arduous and often dangerous job. Without the brave individuals who risk their lives gathering data during wartime, detailed military maps could not be drawn. These maps could make the difference between victory and defeat. In the arena of war, there will always be a need for the mapmaker. Maps have always been important during wartime, but there was one period in history when they were critical. During the Second World War, a series of maps of the French coastline were created through incredible feats of ingenuity and bravery. They were produced in the 4 years leading up to D-Day and ultimately contributed to the end of the war. The creation of the D-Day invasion maps is one of the most incredible stories ever to be told. The painstaking mapping of hundreds of miles of heavily defended French coastline would be the most extensive map-making endeavor ever undertaken. The maps would focus on the 5 beaches which would later become the landing sites for the D-Day invasion. The mapmaker's task was to create accurate maps of the beaches and nearby targets, just for one momentous day.
These are the invasion maps that were prepared specifically for the Overlord landings in June 1944. The beaches are the British and Canadian beaches, the Sword, Juno and Gold, and then we have the American beaches, Omaha and Utah.
Behind every line and point plotted on these maps lies a personal story. From the British, Canadian and American pilots who photographed every mile of the French coastline, risking their lives on every mission, to the special operations men and women from Allied forces who went to extreme lengths to gather information for the maps. To the French resistance, who worked tirelessly behind enemy lines, often in great danger. What makes these maps so unique is the sheer scale and volume of their creation.
In the space of 6 months leading up to D-Day, more than 80 million maps were produced. It was the most amazing map production exercise in times of war ever to have been seen.
Thousands of people added vital pieces of information to a giant jigsaw. But how would these maps change history?
Had the mapping been treated with casual indifference, then maybe events would have turned out very, very differently, and the world that we live in today would be a very different world.
Today, the beaches of Normandy are peaceful, but during the Second World War, they became a bloody battlefield. By 1941, Hitler's forces occupied most of Europe. There was only a small stretch of water between Nazi-occupied France and Britain. Hitler still hoped the British might soon be compelled to surrender. His forces were only 22 miles from British soil and had the enemy in their sights. Europeans created a powerful alliance, and a joint military operation was begun. The Allies realized they would have to take the war to the heart of Hitler's empire if they were to succeed. An invasion would have to be launched on the northern coast of France. Initially, little was known of the German fortifications along the French coastline. The French maps available at the time were outdated and lacking in detail.
All that was available was French 1 to 80,000 mapping, which had been undertaken in the 19th century, and a great deal of it hadn't been revised since about the 1890s. This is a copy of one of the French maps that was available, and it's easy to see at a glance that it isn't very informative. Everything is in black and white. It's not possible to distinguish between roads and rivers easily. The relief is shown by old-fashioned hachures. There are no contours, very few spot heights.
The 1 to 80,000 maps were not detailed enough for the Allies to plot enemy positions, such as gun emplacements, so new, large-scale maps had to be created. Information for these maps came from many quarters. If the Allies could gather enough information, it would help them to decide when and where an invasion should take place. For this, they would need assistance from their friends on the ground in France. The French resistance could provide invaluable intelligence about what the German forces were up to along the Normandy coastline. Meanwhile, in secret locations hidden around London, military intelligence units met to work on invasion planning. The most important site was Churchill's own war rooms, hidden deep underground in Whitehall. It was here that Churchill was surrounded by maps of all the war zones. He was constantly updated as developments occurred.
We're in the central map room here within the Cabinet War Rooms. This was Churchill's nerve centre during the whole of the war. And within this map room we've got a whole range of topographical information. You've got map indexes, naval charts, maps which were produced by the geographical section of the General Staff. We've got on the walls the crucial convoy plot. You've got on other walls of the map room theatres of operations, wall maps.
Information was key to Churchill's campaign. The maps in the war rooms changed almost on a daily basis. Churchill realized the importance of maps in times of conflict.
Churchill had a passionate interest in maps, and he was really quite obsessed by maps. He was a figure like Napoleon, for example, who had a very broad strategic command, and the map for him encapsulated the visual image of the whole campaign.
Even the walls of Churchill's bedroom in the Cabinet War Rooms were covered with maps. He surrounded himself with these images day and night. He understood that accurate maps were essential to the outcome of the war. In 1942, Churchill learned of Hitler's plans to build a line of fortifications at key points along the northern French coast. Had to find out exactly how Hitler was planning to stop them from getting into France. German plan was to create a vast series of concrete bunkers and gun positions, fortified by an array of obstacles. These would stretch along the entire coastline of northern France. The awesome defences would be known as the Atlantic Wall.
If German propaganda was to be believed, the Atlantic Wall represented an impenetrable system of coastal fortifications, stretching all the way from the Arctic Circle in northern Norway down to the Spanish border of the Pyrenees, a distance of about 2,500 miles. And at least on paper it was composed of a formidable system of defences. Obstacles on the beaches to rip the guts out of landing craft as they came ashore, minefields, barbed wire entanglements, bunkers, machine guns, mortars, flamethrowers, and of course large pieces of coastal defence artillery to sink the landing ships in before they got to the shoreline.
Hitler's plans for defending the North Atlantic coastline would make Europe impenetrable to an Allied attack. Or so they hoped. Yet, in an incredible act of bravery, one French resistance member made a discovery which would have a significant impact on the Allies' invasion plans. It was May 1942, and the Frenchman's name was René Duché. Duché was a painter and decorator based in Caen, who was a member of the Century Resistance Cell. He risked his life on many occasions to gather information for the Allies. Little did he realize the true value of one particular find in his hometown. Caen was also home to a regional office of the Todd Organization, which was responsible for planning and constructing the Atlantic Wall. The Todd office in Caen held many secrets. If only Duché could find a way in. One day an opportunity arose for him to get into the building and to get his hands on top-secret military plans. For the first time, his son Jacques Duché visits the room where his father risked his life in an act of great courage.
Mon père, il s'est rappelé qu'il avait vu à la mairie de Caen une affichette qui demandait l'adjudication de travaux de peinture à l'entreprise Todd.
By submitting a quote much lower than anyone else, Duché won the decorating contract and access to the building. Once inside, he carried on with his work, yet when he was left on his own for a moment, he saw his chance and grabbed a large document from a pile on the commandant's desk. It was a blueprint detailing the planned Atlantic Wall defenses along the Normandy coast. But how could he get it out of the building?
Il a pris le plan dans la main et il s'est demandé qu'est-ce qu'il pouvait en faire et il s'est aperçu qu'il y avait une glace. Il s'est reculé et il a vu qu'entre la glace et le mur, il y avait un espace qui était assez important. Il a essayé de glisser la carte, mais manque de chance, elle était trop épaisse. Ce qui fait que tout doucement, sans faire trop de bruit, il l'a ouverte en deux et il l'a glissée derrière la glace.
The Atlantic Wall blueprints contained technical details and architectural plans of the German fortifications, which would be very useful to the Allies. But Duché had to get into the Todd headquarters once more to retrieve it from behind the mirror. Under the pretense of completing the decoration, he returned to the room and secreted the blueprint inside a roll of wallpaper, before making a careful exit. If Duché had been caught with the map, it would have meant certain death. He had to pass the map on through the resistance network as quickly as possible. Fortunately, he knew where to go. He took the document to the meeting place for the resistance in Caen, the Café des Touristes.
Dans le Café des Touristes, dans la cave, il y avait une vieille chaudière. Et c'était cette vieille chaudière qui servait de boîte aux lettres pour la résistance. Et c'est comme ça que lorsque mon père a quitté l'entreprise Todd avec le plan, il a été au Café du Touriste pour mettre le plan dans la chaudière.
Whilst at the Café des Touristes, Touchet met the head of the Caen Century cell, Monsieur Girard, who asked him in code if he had any mail. Girard was astounded by what he saw.
Mon père lui a dit oui, je crois que j'ai le plan du mur de l'Atlantique. Et là, Marcel Girard l'a pris et monté à Paris pour le donner au colonel Rémy.
Gilbert Renaud, also known as Colonel Rémy, was the head of the French resistance. He was working undercover in Paris directly for General Charles de Gaulle, who was based in London. Once the Allies found out about the blueprint, they knew it could give them precise details about the German defense plans along the Normandy coast. Such information would be gold dust for those working on the invasion maps. Colonel Rémy's cover had been blown, and the Germans were closing in on him. He had to get to London, as did the Atlantic War blueprint, before he was captured. The Allies could not risk the chance that Rémy could be caught and tortured. He knew too much. The documents in his possession could change the outcome of the war. Rémy had to act quickly. Arrangements were made for him to escape with his wife and young children on a French fishing boat. They would meet the English out at sea. It was a dangerous plan. His son, Jean-Claude Renaud, remembers the experience well.
À l'époque où mon père a suivi les plans du mur de l'Atlantique, nous étions quasiment en panique. Les Allemands voulant mettre la main sur ma mère et sur nous, pour que mon père se rende, pour forcer mon père à se rendre. Aussi, le général de Gaulle lui a dit l'ordre de tout faire pour nous faire passer à l'Angleterre.
The escape was fraught with difficulties. Rémy communicated via radio with the Allies to arrange the time and date of the pickup. But first they had to get out of the harbour, hidden in the cramped hold of the boat, in the early hours of the morning. In order to protect the blueprint, Rémy decided to hide it in a biscuit tin. Rémy and his family didn't know if they would make it, but it was their only chance of survival.
Lorsque nous sommes partis pour Devel, il était 5h du matin, nous avions une chance sur 1000 de passer à travers les mailles de la Gestapo.
By a miracle, their boat made it out of the harbour without being checked. Jean-Claude recalls sitting on the biscuit tin, which contained the precious blueprint during the journey. Out at sea, they were picked up by a disguised boat from England, crewed with special operations men. Once on dry land, Colonel Rémy took the map straight to London.
Ces plans furent immédiatement transmis à l'état-major interallié et en particulier atterrirent dans les mains de Lord Louis Mountbatten qui allait coordonner les opérations de préparation du débarquement.
I don't know that I can think of anything more important than the document that Grenadier stole at Caen. It was absolutely invaluable. I handled it when I was at Combined Ops, because you had there not only the exact location of every battery, which was itself jolly useful, but also the exact size and placing of the concrete reinforcing rods inside the concrete and the strength of cement used to make the concrete, which for a gunner was invaluable. All you had to do was to make a replica using exactly those methods and see which sort of shell you needed to knock it down.
The information provided by the Atlantic Wall blueprint certainly would have informed those planning the invasion about what type of weapons would be most effective. The Atlantic Wall blueprint went to the highest level of Allied command and to Churchill himself, but the Allies were not ready for an invasion of France. They did not yet have the accurate large-scale maps of the French coastline which they would need before an invasion could take place. In the summer of 1942, the Allies would embark upon the largest project in the history of map-making. There was a window of opportunity. Hitler's forces were distracted by heavy fighting on the Russian front. This would buy time for the Allies, who could focus on preparations for the invasion of France and the defeat of the Nazis. Churchill ordered a top-secret mapping project called Operation Benson.
In order to avoid all mention of the fact that it was invasion coastline that was being mapped, the security term Benson was used, and this was named after the Oxfordshire airfield where 140 Squadron RAF, the Air Reconnaissance Squadron, set off to do their air photography of the invasion area.
The Benson project would culminate in a set of highly accurate maps of the geography of France, including landmarks and the technical data required to plan the invasion. Extremely skilled pilots were used to take thousands of detailed photographs from which would be made topographical maps. Pilots had to fly at a constant height, often repeatedly over the same area, and were at great risk of being shot down. Peter Fahey was one such pilot who flew repeated secret photographic missions as a 22-year-old airman.
Before D-Day, we were photographing the beaches, the bridges, the transport facilities like canals and railway lines, and airfields.
By flying low and using high-quality cameras, the pilot could pick up incredible details. The planes were fitted with special cameras, which were positioned just behind the pilot. He would take a photograph at the precise position. The pilots were required to fly in overlapping lines, so photographs of strips of land could be produced. The planes were not fitted with guns in order to make them lighter and easier to fly, but without weapons, they were vulnerable. The French coastline was becoming a giant jigsaw, with the pieces slowly coming together. By the end of 1942, the large-scale Benson maps were complete. They contained details of all the rivers, canals, roads and contours along the Normandy coast. The foundation work had now been achieved. It was time for the next phase.
Almost unparalleled in the history of military cartography was the necessity now of putting onto the maps details not only of enemy positions, but of the kind of ammunition, the firepower, what kind of gun, what kind of artillery was there. None of this had appeared on military mapping before, but now we had a whole range of military firepower to represent on the map.
Spitfire pilots had to fly even lower and directly over German gun positions to get this specific information. invasion maps.
Low-level flights were called dicers because originally it was thought that we were dicing with death doing them, because the targets were generally hotspots like bridges, airfields, warships, and really they were pretty frantic. You flew low under enemy radar, you had one chance to get the target, and one only, and dicing with death. Doing the very things you were warned in your training never to do. Never scrape the rooftops.
Peter Fahy was lucky. Many of his colleagues were shot down and ended up in occupied France. Somehow they had to make it back to England. The French resistance helped many Allied pilots escape from France, but the pilots also carried a crucial piece of kit to help them find their way. The airmen often wore a very special type of scarf. Once unfolded, it turned into a map of the country over which they were flying. Combined with a compass, it could help airmen get to a safe area. The escape maps were printed on silk and were highly detailed and extremely durable. The advantage of a silk map was that it didn't break if it got wet. It didn't rustle when airmen were in hiding, and it could be folded into an extremely small package to be secreted around a pilot's body. Even with ingeniously designed maps, it was incredibly difficult for airmen to make it home. Many were picked up by the Germans and transferred to prisoner of war camps. It was their duty to try and escape, and the Allies had another secret plan involving the use of maps. It was decided that the Allies should attempt to get escape maps into the prison camps. The idea was the brainchild of a man from the intelligence services called Christopher Clayton Hutton. Hutton knew that the British Red Cross was allowed to supply parcels to the Allied POWs in enemy territory. The Germans allowed items such as games to be given to occupy the prisoners. Hutton planned to hide escape maps within these games. He contacted Waddingtons, the makers of the famous board game Monopoly, and devised a plan for hiding escape maps and instruments within the games. Thousands of sets were delivered with maps and even small, crude compasses hidden within the pieces of the game. The Monopoly sets contained a code to indicate which maps were inside. This was shown by a series of full stop marks on different areas of the board. This ensured the right escape maps were sent to the right prison camps. Meanwhile, the photo reconnaissance missions over the Normandy coast continued. Although casualties amongst young photo reconnaissance pilots was high, some did manage to continue flying without being shot or captured. The photographs they brought back from their sorties revealed ever-changing details of the Normandy coast. Most of the photographs from their missions were taken straight to RAF Medmenham in Berkshire, where teams of men and women called photo interpreters studied millions of images. German plans for the Atlantic Wall from the stolen blueprint, but the photographs enabled them to confirm the actual location and size of the fortifications. These details were added to the Benson maps as a series of printed overlays.
All the photographs analysed at RAF Medmenham would have come from the photographic reconnaissance squadrons. Those were the photographic units based at RAF Benson, but RAF Medmenham would have been responsible for looking at, in what we call second and third phase, in other words, an in-depth look at photography flown by other units right throughout the country. Medmenham was, in fact, the skill area, if you like, for all of the detailed topics that were studied, and this includes industry, communications, infrastructure, terrain. There were experts there on shipbuilders, aircraft manufacturing, all brought in, of course, to produce the information and the intelligence that the community required.
The photo interpreters at Medmenham used equipment called stereoscopes to view three-dimensional photographs. The pictures were taken simultaneously by two cameras and enabled the interpreters to gauge distances and heights of objects on the ground. More accurate details could be identified, such as German troop positions. The invasion planning became more specific, and the exact landing areas were becoming defined.
Aerial photography was absolutely critical to the Allies. By 1944, with detailed, skilled interpreters, you could get an immense amount out of aerial photographs, even those taken at maybe 30 or 35,000 feet. And the Allies are taking literally millions of these from 1940 onwards. And they then put the information onto the maps to bring them right up to date so that they're actually useful to the soldiers going ashore and fighting in Normandy.
Spitfire pilots were also required to take another kind of aerial photograph, which would be of specific use to the forces landing during the invasion. Oblique photographs were taken of the beaches where troops would disembark from the landing crafts. The images would show the view which the soldiers would see on the day of the invasion when arriving on the beaches. It would allow them to recognize landmarks and ensure they were at the right location. On this photograph, it's possible to see just how close the German artillery came to hitting the plane taking this picture. The bullets can clearly be seen landing in the water just a few feet away. These photographs were often added along the bottom of the invasion maps.
The oblique view of the coastline, which underlies the map here, gives a first-class impression of what the soldier would encounter as he was coming into land, so that he can match up the landmarks which he sees visually on his first eye contact with the invasion coast with the landmarks that are marked on his map. Of the 5 exits from the beach that were available for the invasion on Omaha Beach, 3 of them are shown on this map. We have one beach exit here, and you can see on the map that it's marked here, and in fact it's a good secondary road that curves round by a house with a strong point here, marked on the panorama. We see what it would have looked like on visual contact from the boat. The beach exit here, going along the road, passing the house, and then coming up the valley here.
Specific details, such as unusual or prominent buildings, would be marked on the oblique views to help the soldiers find their way during the invasion. But the Allies needed yet more detail, and to help them with this endeavour, they turned to the British public for help. The BBC was ordered to put out a call to all its radio listeners. They were asked to gather personal photographs and postcards of the French coast. An recent holiday snap taken before the war could contain information to help build a complete picture of each of the 5 designated invasion beaches. In a week, over 1 million images flooded in. In total, 10 million pictures were received and sent to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, where they were sorted into locations. Those which contained pertinent information were sent to Medmenham to be analysed in more detail. The postcards and pictures sent by the public showed landscape details such as cliffs or ports. Images from the ground and aerial photographs were extremely valuable. However, the Allies knew they could not rely on photographs alone.
The Allies obviously wanted as much confirmation of what they could get out of aerial photography and other intelligence sources as was possible. And really there's no substitute for the man on the ground. The guy can actually get close up to the bunker and measure it out maybe by pacing alongside it. And of course it's worth bearing in mind that in summer of 1944 there was something like 85,000 Frenchmen working on constructing the Atlantic Wall. These guys can feed information back to the resistance cells in Caen and Bayeux and other French towns, and this information can then be passed on to the British so that they can build it into their own maps.
As planning for the invasion became more intense, the Allies needed details which they could not get from aerial photography alone. The French resistance on the ground in Normandy could help with the gaps in the Allies' knowledge.
Resistance could be of enormous help. You could get a great deal from them, provided you had the communications.
Communications would be key. The Allies sent radio messages to France requesting specific information, but anyone found with a radio would be shot. The resistance had to be inventive. Andre Heinz was a resistance member who built his own radio receiver, but disguised it in a very clever way.
Ça c'est mon poste à galène. J'étais obligé de fabriquer quelque chose de très petit, puisqu'il était défendu de garder une radio pendant l'occupation allemande. Et comme j'avais les éléments pour construire un poste à galène, j'ai rassemblé ça sur quelque chose de réduit et caché ça dans une boîte de conserve, parce que je pouvais le garder dans la cave avec 2 autres boîtes pleines de haricots secs.
Coded messages were sent to France over the BBC. Radio receivers were simple to make, but transmitters were more difficult. The resistance had to resort to other methods to get their information out of France. The RAF dropped homing pigeons from the air in containers attached to small parachutes. Hundreds of birds were dropped during the war. Within each container, there was also a small canister designed to be attached to the bird's leg, along with urgent requests for specific intelligence from the Allies. The resistance placed notes about troop movements and coastal defences in the canisters, and then released the homing pigeons to fly back to England. But it was not an entirely reliable way of getting information.
Les pigeons qui étaient parachutés en France avec des tout petits parachutes, les gens du pays répondaient en général à ces questions-là. Et par ailleurs, les Allemands qui étaient le long de la côte avaient des ordres très stricts de tuer tout pigeon qui s'en allait vers la mer. Et certainement, beaucoup de pigeons n'atteignent jamais l'Angleterre.
It was not only the birds who were in danger. The Germans had orders to execute anyone found with a homing pigeon. The pigeons could only be released for it was an extremely dangerous exercise. The Germans also trained hunting birds of prey, such as hawks, to kill the pigeons, but those that did return to England provided useful intelligence. As D-Day neared, the French were called upon on a daily basis. The resistance around the town of Caen was particularly involved in preparing detailed information for maps. Ingenious methods were used to gather the information, whilst specialist units within the resistance compiled the intelligence into maps. One particularly important resistance mapmaker was called Robert Dewar. Dewar did not have large-scale maps of the coast, so before he could add information, he had to draw these by hand. His son, Remy Dewar, remembers how dangerous and time-consuming the operation became for his father.
Ses premières missions furent donc les renseignements et d'établir le plan des défenses allemandes de notre côte et du Cotentin, c'est-à-dire le sud de la Manche et le Calvados. Pour établir le plan des défenses allemandes, on est parti de la carte d'état-major, mais cette carte-là était trop petite et pour avoir des précisions, on est obligé d'agrandir cette carte. C'est là où j'ai aidé mon père, c'est-à-dire que j'ai certains éléments.
Remy Dewar enlarged key areas of the Ordnance Survey map for his father, who would then add the intelligence information. The map was marked into 13 square-mile sections, and individual resistance members were each allocated a square to map. From housewives to young children, they would mark their specific squares with details they had seen. These maps were then passed to Dewar, who joined them together. Yet how could they make measurements in secret?
Certaines mesures n'existant pas, on était obligé de le faire en nous comme on se déplaçait à bicyclette. Connaissant le développement par le nombre de tours de pédalier, on avait des distances.
But how effective were the resistance methods?
Je me souviens même entre Saint-Aubin et Langrune avoir rajouté un chemin qui n'existait pas sur la carte d'état-major. Ce chemin, j'ai eu la joie, entre guillemets, de le voir sur une carte d'un officier anglais après le débarquement, chose qui signifiait que cette carte avait servi aux Alliés.
The resistance maps were sent to England in secret dispatches and incorporated into the D-Day invasion maps. As D-Day approached, it became vital that Hitler be taken by complete surprise. A higher classification of security was adopted, which had never been used before.
For the first and the only time in the Second World War, the Allies allocated to the Normandy planning a whole new security classification level, and they called it Bigot. Bigoted meant that you could see the maps and the operational orders for the Normandy invasion, and quite clearly these were things that were only available, up until the last few days at least, to people who were really senior in the planning process.
If you were bigoted, you were extremely privileged and one of a very elite group.
I don't know how many of us there were. I suppose there were about 1,000 who were in the innermost secret of where the invasion was going to take place. We were not told when, but we were told where. We had a pass marked bigot, and you could say to somebody, "Are you bigoted, old boy?" If he said, "I've no idea what you're talking about," you knew you couldn't talk to him about where the invasion was going to happen. If you wanted to do any work on the detailed site of the invasion, you had a rather odd journey to make. You went to Oxford Circus, where the northeast corner is now occupied by a large, rather garish clothes shop called Top Shop. In those days it was a rather dowdy department store called Peter Roberts. You went in, you went up to the second floor. There was an archway marked ladies, corsets and underwear, which of course no gentleman would think of going through, but you went through all the same. We met a sentry, we said, "Your pass, sir?" If you couldn't produce a bigot pass, you got no farther. But if you did produce your bigot pass, you went into a large room with a very large wall, about 40 feet long, with a colossal map on it, at a scale of 1 in 10,000, over 6 inches to a mile, showing the whole of the invasion area, with every single blockhouse, every ditch marked. That was perfectly splendid for doing minute tactical research on some particular part of the landing area.
But the geography of the land would not be the only important aspect of the map. To allow the destroyers and gunships to get as close to the shore as possible, it would also be important to know the topography of the seabed.
It's obviously important that your smaller craft like destroyers and your heavier craft like cruisers and battleships who are going to work along certain lanes in firing on the beach, coming out again, are not going to hit obstacles and so on. So that sort of underwater information, intelligence is very, very important.
When the invasion beaches were finally agreed, focus was thrown onto the logistics of the landings. But the planners questioned if one of the beaches could sustain a massive onslaught.
One of the things that the Allies were really concerned about was that the beaches would be strong enough to stand up to large tanks landing on them in wet conditions. Sherman tank, the main battle tank of the Allies in 1944, weighs 34 tons, and the last thing you wanted to do when it goes ashore is sink into the sand.
So the Allies would embark upon a dangerous intelligence mission.
New Year's Eve 1943-44, 2 British personnel swim ashore on one of the beaches, Gold Beach, and under the glare of the lighthouse operated for the first time by the Germans in several months, they take peat and sand samples from the beach itself, from right underneath the Germans' noses, because these things are going to be absolutely essential if they're going to know that the beach is strong enough.
The 2 men who swam ashore on January the 1st, 1944, were soldiers from the Special Forces. They took an enormous risk. Information on the consistency of the sand had to reach England, or the beach could not be selected for the invasion.
As they swim back out to the submarine that had brought them to the French coast, one of them turns and yells to the other, "Happy New Year!" which is a wonderfully English way to commemorate perhaps a really dangerous and frightening operation.
The sand samples proved that Gold Beach was suitable for the landings. There was other data which had to be included on the invasion maps, such as the gradients of the beaches, specifically the height of sand under the water at certain tidal positions. The maps had to contain this vital information if an attack was to be successful.
This map was prepared less than a month in advance of the D-Day landings on Omaha Beach. On the back of the map is all the information about the beach gradients, which would be encountered by the landing craft, and particularly important is the sort of information that says that the depressions in the beach gradient drain of sea water at low tide, so you would be stranded in a landing craft.
By May 1944, the Allies had a complete set of invasion maps. All that Churchill Churchill and Eisenhower needed were the right weather conditions. On June the 6th, after 2 years of planning and meticulous map-making, the invasion was finally launched.
No doubt that those maps and the detail they had on them saved a great number of lives.
The creation of the beach invasion maps at Sword, Gold, Juneau, Utah, and Omaha was a unique military operation.
The importance of these maps to the history of military cartography and to military history itself cannot be underestimated.
For every line drawn or military detail marked, men and women risked their lives. There were many who died as a result of their efforts, but without such maps, the invasion would have been doomed to failure.
The significance of the Normandy invasion maps is immense. Had these maps been inaccurate and unreliable, D-Day might have failed.
But in fact, D-Day's success led to the end of the war. The D-Day invasion maps are a testament to those who created them. The story of these fragile pieces of paper